In this video, I'd like to explore the routes and how routes are managed within ASP.NET MVC. So up to this point, we've dealt primarily with controllers, and we followed what is referred to as the default route, where to get access to a particular action, you go controller/action. That's not just by convention, but that's by a configuration. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at how that works, and then we're actually going to build our own routes and be able to make some changes to them to make them more functional and maybe even a little cleaner. Now, if you're familiar with things such as search engine optimization or SEO, then you'll be familiar with how important it is to have good URLs and then actually dealing with functionality moving within your application and then having URLs that stay consistent for your search engines. So underneath the app_start, we went into the route config, and inside of here you'll see that there's an ignore route and then map route, and this is our default route that I was referring to. Now, the way that the routes are set up and the way they work is that you have a route name, you have a route URL, which is a pattern, and then you have defaults. There's additional elements that we'll talk about later that you can also add. But just to start off simply, these are what you need in order to create a route. So this statement right here is the route statement. This is the definition of the route. And this is our default route. So you'll notice here in the URL we have certain parameters such as controller/action/an ID. And then down here we have default. So it says the default controller is home, the default action is index, and the default ID is optional. So that means that if we don't type in a controller, an action, or an ID, that the route will default to home/index. That's why when you open up your app for the first time, you automatically pull the index action off your home controller. This is what triggers that to happen. Additionally, we have an ID, but it's optional. So if our URL comes through as controller/action/a number, let's say, that number is treated as a model binding variable of ID. And that ID then will be passed into your application, or rather into your action, as an input parameter if there's an ID parameter defined on your action. So that is what's handled by default. And you'll notice with some of the templates they utilize ID as a reference, and if you mouse over or click on one of those links, you'll even find that it follows this convention that's part of the route of controller/action/ID. So let's go ahead and create our own route. So we can go routes.maproute. And these are rather lengthy, so I like to kind of put some space here. And then we'll start out by saying the name of our route, and I'm going to call it login. And what my goal here is I want to create a route that will allow me to go to my app/login instead of going to account/login. I just want it to be /login. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that my URL is login. And what I'm doing here is I'm saying this word, if it exists in the URL, then it needs to be routed a particular way. So then I'll do comma, and I'll say my defaults, :new, and then I'll say controller equals account, comma, action equals login. And what that'll do is that will say when I go to login as my default route, I will actually be redirecting to the account controller with the login action. So let's see what that looks like at runtime. So we'll go ahead and save and run. So let's first start by logging out. So when we start our application again, it still directs us to account/login. And you'll notice that this is not pointing to login. So you may be going, okay, well, let's go login. So we'll go to login, and it tells us that the resource cannot be found. So one thing that you need to be aware of is that when you define routes, that your routes have to be defined in most specific to most general. And what we've done right now, I'm going to go ahead and stop my debug, is that we've got this kind of catch-all route before the login route. So we need to actually cut and move this route above the quote-unquote catch-all route, or the default route. The name itself has no relevance, by the way. If you're thinking, well, the default route is just because that's the default, that's what it uses. It's named that, but it doesn't have any bearing on its functionality. So I just want to kind of clarify that. So let's go ahead and build and start again. And we'll see here when it started up, it goes to login. And if we click on the login link, it also points to login. Now, if you noticed, I didn't actually change the URL or any of the markup that was used for this login link. So what happens is that now that we have this route, and I can log in just the same as I did before, when I log in, I'm still going to the account controller and the login action, but the routing system is taking care of that work for me. So if I jump back into here and I go back to my layout, just so you can see what's going on with the navigation, that's under shared underscore layout. And we come down to the login. This action link has a reference to the link text, which is to say login, and then it has the action name, which is login, and the controller, which is account. And the routing system actually is picking up this account controller login action, and it's looking back at the route config and saying, oh, well, that actually should just be a URL of /login. And by making that adjustment through the routing system, that's how we end up with the URL that we end up with for our login of just /login. So it's very powerful to be able to do things like this. So let's go ahead and do another one just as a quick example. So let's make our log out the same idea. So we'll just copy this and we'll change this to be log out, and we'll change this to be log out, and then we'll point to the log out action. So we'll go ahead and build, and we'll see here that it still points to account/login, and the reason for that is because our web config is pointing to this. Now this still works, that's still a legitimate URL of account/login because we're still pointing to the account controller and the login action. If we wanted to make it always go to login, we would simply have to go into our web config, come down to our authentication config, and change this to be /login. Now if I save that change, it's going to stop my debug session, so I'm going to say no for now, and I'll save that later. But I can go ahead and log in. And after I'm logged in, we'll check out the logout URL. And the logout URL points to my localhost, my port /logout. So I'll go ahead and click logout, and it logs me out. So that's how you can do custom routes for your application. If you want to have a specific experience where people are going to just a simple one path URL instead of going to a controller/action every time, you can work to build these routes. Now don't go crazy with them because they do become very complex when you start building a lot of routes, but there is a lot of power in having that control over that routing situation so that you're not just going in and always hitting the account/or controller/action type of URLs.